Hello. Today's story that matters is a big one and a famous one. It is Don Quixote by Cervantes. You can see that my copy of it is doesn't have the cover anymore because I've actually read it a few times over the years back before I had a Kindle, before Kindles existed. Um, This may not be the most obvious candidate for a story that matters. Of course, my stories that matter are the ones that contain crucial survival information, which is why they're passed down throughout the generations. Although Don Quixote has been around for 500 years and is still being read, is still famous, that's a good evidence for its importance, but it's also just really silly. It's a comedy. I do think comedies are just as likely to contain useful information, survival information, as tragedies. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this today. It's also just a lot of fun. Saw it on my shelf and thought, um, let's revisit it. Okay. So, first off, it's not quite right to call Don Quixote a story. It's really dozens, not dozens, it's hundreds of stories all just kind of smashed together between two covers. We call this style, this form, picaresque. The picaresque is a novel that is made up of a bunch of little adventures just strung together. The way I like to see the picaresque is through a visual of barbed wire. It's a linear, just straight line, smooth part of the way, but every, few inches, a cluster of pointy conflicts, these little stories, and that's what happens with Don Quixote. So, for those of you who just arrived on the planet, I'll quickly summarize the novel. It's about a guy, a country gentleman named Alonso Quijada. He's just a really normal guy. He's not super rich, but he's wealthy enough to where he doesn't really have to work much. He lives way out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody pays attention to him. He's not important. And he is presumably has a kind of forgettable existence. His one thing that he's into, he's addicted to stories of knights, fantasy stories of knights errant and dragons and maidens and wizards, that kind of stuff, which is just amazing to think that those were those stories were really important 500 years ago, and they're at least as popular now. So in the fantasy genre, surely there's some survival information being passed down. And Don Quixote, interestingly, in satirizing that genre, also reminds us why it's important. So the he's reading these books, this nobody guy, and through just kind of madness or desperation or just boredom leading to madness, he decides he's going to become a knight errant. And so he assembles a ludicrous kit, knight kit. He puts on some old armor, gets an old horse, has his servant become his squire, and he just goes off riding off away from his farm and looking for trouble, and he finds the trouble. And the trouble he finds is always really a clash between his delusions and his fantasies. And he just, most of the novel is him just getting his ass kicked over and over. And it is very funny and it's interesting also. Um, and that's kind of goes on for 1,000 pages. And it's, it was a big bestseller in its time, and it's still being read and taught and discussed. Um, I find it, for my purposes here, as a story that matters. I find that it matters in two ways. One, it reminds us how crucial having meaning in our lives is, and the extents will go when we aren't concerned with our direct survival, when we've become wealthy enough to where we have a lot of leisure time. um, the extents will go to create meaning. And let's think about the kind of meaning that Quixote finds or thinks or invents. his whole life as a knight errant is dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. And he, you know, the problem is that he's actually not really protecting anybody. It's all happening in his head, and he's always getting beat up because he's his misunderstanding of reality. But that's the second important uh, part of this novel. The important lesson we get is that as we search for meaning in our lives, and as we try to become the kind of person that helps others, we mustn't succumb to grandiose ideas. We just shouldn't be taking ourselves too seriously. And reality has a way of just smacking down our grandest ideas of ourselves, and that's really why this novel is such a pleasure to read, and also why it feels so true. Um, Quixote thinks he's wearing a helmet, but really what he's wearing is a barber's basin. He thinks he's attacking a giant, but it's famously he's attacking windmills, and the windmills win, which is even funnier. So, what do we learn from this? Well, I think we really do need to figure out ways in our lives to find a sense of meaning. And if we are lucky enough to have excess wealth, resources beyond taking care of ourselves and our immediate family, I really think the novel tells us the place to find that meaning is in helping others. I know that sounds pretty pious, and that's the second lesson we're going to get here is that when we start thinking of ourselves as pure and virtuous and pious, and we're just so, oh, I'm doing so much good, we got to remember that we are way more like uh, Quijada, the what's his name, Alonso Quijada, the country gentleman with a tin pot on his head, rather than Don Quixote, the important person. Um, and at the very end of the novel, Quixote just renounces everything he believed. He just becomes sane, like just almost by magic. Almost. My reading of it is that he always knew. He was always just pretending because it was better than just because life was so intolerably boring that he just said, I'm just going to pretend I'm a knight and I'm going to stick with it. That's my story, and I'm not veering from it. But at the very end of his life, on his deathbed, he is like, "Hey, all those stupid books, I shouldn't have read them. I know I'm not Don Quixote. I'm just a regular guy." And he wills all of his belongings to his family and his servants, and everybody cries because he was actually a very gentle person and beloved by everybody. And he dies in peace. He's perfectly happy. Um, and I think what he's done is he has hit that balance between meaning and reality. And it's okay that we're not important. But that doesn't mean that in our short time here on life, during life, we shouldn't use what we have to do something worthwhile for other people. And I'm going to end with a joke by George Carlin, just so I don't take myself too seriously. And George Carlin, comedian, of course, uh, died a couple 10 years ago, something like that. I don't know. But George Carlin has had this one joke about US state mottos, and he's comparing or contrasting um, live free or die. Which, gosh, is that Delaware? I think that's Delaware. Live free or die. And then Idaho's motto is famous potatoes. And Carlin says, somewhere between these two lies the truth. And I get the feeling the truth is closer to famous potatoes.